Good afternoon. Welcome to today's Heritage Lunch and Learn on When a Story Finds You, The Babes in the Wood, Cold Case, and Unexpected Discoveries. My name is Sarah Carlson, and I'm the Program Manager of Vancouver Heritage Foundation. I have the pleasure of being joined by Katarina Thorsen this afternoon, and we're both really delighted to have you here with us. VHF recognizes the diverse history and cultural heritage of Vancouver, and that the city, as it is known today, is located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. So we ask that wherever you're joining us from today, that you reflect upon the knowledge of and the relationship you have with the people whose lands you may occupy. One of our aims as an organization is to give context and provide resources to better understand the historic legacies we live with today and the systemic injustices that continue to exist. We all have a responsibility to learn from the uncomfortable truths of the past and the present, and to work together going forward. For those of you who aren't familiar with VHF, we are a registered charity that raises awareness of the vital contribution that heritage makes to a vibrant, inclusive, and sustainable community. We advance the appreciation and conservation of our city's diverse heritage places and their stories through our educational programming, like this Lunch and Learn, special projects, informational resources, and grants. We're really excited to continue to offer these Heritage Lunch and Learns virtually. The Lunchtime Talks feature current heritage projects and topics, and we're really excited to spotlight one of our Yosef Wosk publication grant recipients here this afternoon. There will be time for questions at the end, so if you have any questions, the chat box is the best place to put those, and we will be able to get to them at the end after Kat has presented. So we're really grateful to have Katarina here to share her experience and insights with us this afternoon on this really unique project. So Katarina Thorsen is an artist, writer, and researcher passionate in her belief that art can heal, build connections, and deepen exploration. The heart of her work is visual storytelling, restorative practices, whole brain engagement, and creative facilitation. Katarina published her first book, Drawn Together, Maintaining Connections and Navigating Life's Challenges with Art, in 2013. Her current project is a graphic novel entitled Yosef, a true story and Vancouver-based family saga from 1924 to 1963. Thanks so much for being here, Kat. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you so much to Vancouver Heritage Foundation for this wonderful opportunity. It's lovely to be here. I'm going to be sharing for the first time ever a presentation. I usually wing it when I do online facilitation or in-person facilitation. So this is a unique experience for me to have put together a presentation for you. So bear with me as I will stay on topic and read through the material that I've gathered for you. So before I start, I'm joining you from my kitchen here close to Stanley Park, and I want to acknowledge that I was born in Sweden, but I'm really deeply grateful to be on these lands with the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. It is a profound honor to live so close to the park, and I try to access it daily. And there's a heron in this picture, so most of the images that you'll see in this presentation are drawn by myself. And yesterday I was out for a walk and saw about 6 herons on one building, several on another as they're getting ready to go to the heronry, which is just a block from me. So it's an exciting springtime here in Stanley Park. And so this story does touch on true crime, and I'm going to be sharing how I kind of got involved in this particular project. So I just want to give a bit of a content warning that even though a lot of the images are drawn, some of the content does touch on physical evidence, on homicide, filicide, suicide, mental health treatment, and some illustrations contain some imagery of violence. I just wanted to put that out there. So how did I get involved? So the overview of this presentation today, it's pretty vast. And so from 2003 to 2004, I volunteered as a researcher and student criminal profiler with the Babes in the Woods Task Force. And the task force goal was to identify the skeletal remains of 2 children found in Stanley Park in January 1953. So in this presentation today, I'll share my experiences, my creative approaches, and how my current graphic novel project, Yosef, was born out of my time with the task force. And the prologue to the Yosef project was self-published as a limited edition broadsheet or newspaper in 2022, funded in large part by the Yosef Wosk publication fund by the Vancouver Heritage Foundation, which was extremely delightful, but also truly changed the trajectory of my life. So it's a complicated story in terms of combining the Babes in the Woods with my current project. So for this talk, I decided on a simple approach. So who am I? What do I do? How did this story start? When a story finds you, which is the core of this presentation, why this project, and where do I go next? So who am I? As Sarah said in the introduction, I am a visual artist, writer, and creative engagement facilitator and craftivist. So basically, I use art to engage, either with other people or with projects that I am working on. And so I really believe that art can heal, build connections, and uncover truths. So my education history includes biological sciences, visual art, psychology, restorative justice, special education, and behavior evidence analysis, which I'll explain in a bit. But truly, all the things that I have studied all relate to creative approaches and to art. So I use creativity to engage whole brain thinking. So it fosters meaningful dialogue, it facilitates schools to build mission and vision statements, provides safe and inclusive place, and it really helps me with research. And then I use visual storytelling techniques like comics, graphic novels, mind mapping to create deeper understanding and gain insights. And I use these techniques within custody centers, within community programs, care facilities, within restorative justice circle work. I work with a variety of school districts, and I've worked for a long time within alternative school settings. And my clients, as I call them, or folks that I work with, and students have ranged from 5 to 105. And certainly the 105-year-old was one of the most vivid and active people that I've ever worked with. It was quite glorious. And so looking at like why visual storytelling, what is it? So this is a photo of my father and I back in 2012. And my father was my first art teacher, and art provided him with much needed connection to the world after a debilitating stroke. And so we created a book together about our deep relationship with shared creative process during his time, his 7 years in extended care. On October 15th, we sent the manuscript to the publisher, and unfortunately 10 days later, my father passed away, but it was, for lack of a better word, a beautiful death. And our book, Drawn Together, was released in a limited run in 2013. And so for me, as it was for my father, visual storytelling is a biological need. I do it every day, but also it really helps me process research, process the way I live. A student of mine in 2012 said this profound thing, and I'm not sure where she heard it or if she came up with it herself, but without art, we do not die, but without art, we do not live. And that truly is true for myself. And then a big question is, why true crime? Why am I interested in the history of true crime? And this may be a strange thing to share, but when I was about 5 or 6, I had a recurring dream. It occurred for several years. My mother and I in the dream were walking in an abandoned landscape, and it was this gravel road with a cul-de-sac at the end, and there were no buildings. It was these empty fields, and it was distinctly a gravel road. And as we came around the cul-de-sac, we came across a corpse. And it was a human corpse. And these events kept recurring over and over again. We were looping. We were walking down across the gravel road. We'd come around the cul-de-sac and we'd see this corpse. And I knew in the dream when I was little that it should be scary, but it wasn't, because I kept holding my mom's hand. And I felt safe to crouch down and inspect this corpse. And I've always wondered if I inherited this curiosity gene from my mom. She was very interested in the dark side of human nature. And I also wonder if that was the moment I was chosen to tell the story I'm going to share today. So the Babes in the Woods, many of you may have heard of it, but before I talk about the case and my involvement in it, I really want to acknowledge the work of Lazarus, who is a dear friend, And she has done extraordinary coverage on the babes in the woods in her books, Cold Case Vancouver, Cold Case BC, on her blog, evelazarus.com, and on her podcast, Cold Case Canada. So she has all of the news about the latest developments in the case. I'll touch upon it lightly, and I won't go deep into the Babes in the Woods case, but I'm going to talk about my involvement in the case. So it's a bit of a different angle, but I do encourage you to check out Eve Lazarus's work. So how did this start for me? So on October 11th, 2003, back in the day where we still got newspapers, Dad cut out an article about an upcoming topic or a talk at the Vancouver Public Library. And he handed it to me, as he would hand us articles all the time, and said, you might be interested in this. And he certainly was right. And I had personally never heard of the Babes in the Woods case by that time. And it was a cold case, meaning unsolved, involving the unidentified remains of 2 children found in Stanley Park in 1953. And the assumption by the investigators throughout these 50 years was that a mother had killed her 2 children and left them in the park in the late 1940s. So I drew in 2017 what I imagined that day, that fateful day in the park might look like. And this is what I call my crime sketchbook. And the lyrics are from a 1941 song called The Babes in the Wood. And I will just read them out. I will not sing the song. And so this is my imagination of what may have happened back in the late 40s. So when the babes were lost in the gloomy wood, it's no wonder they were so awfully good. 14 angels were watching them, so all the storybooks state. Sandman's coming, and it is growing late. Give me your hand, here where we stand. We're off to slumberland. With you I'll go, although we've no angel chorus watching over us. Moonlight is bright, kiss me goodnight, just like a brother should. I'll put on my little hood, and we'll both be oh so good, like the babes in the wood. Give me your hand, here where we stand. We're off to slumberland. With you I'll go, although we've no angel chorus watching over us. Moonlight is bright. Kiss me goodnight, just like a brother should. I'll put on my little hood, and we'll both be oh so good, like the babes in the wood. So I drew this because I wanted to really know and put myself back in that time, and to really remind myself that this was not just a cold case, but something that actually happened. Something happened to those children, and someone left them in the park. So that's an example of how visual storytelling helps me understand events. So after my dad handed me the article on August 14th, I attended the talk at the Vancouver Public Library Central Branch with my mom. I'm very socially anxious, so I dragged her with me, which was pretty easy. And besides, she's also a history buff and deeply interested in true crime stories. So Timothy Taylor, winner of the 2003 Vancouver Book of the Year called Stanley Park, was the main attraction. And because his book touched on the Babes in the Woods cold case as a thread in this book, and it was the 50th anniversary of the discovery of the children in the park, retired Vancouver Police Department Sergeant Brian Honeybourn and forensic odontologist Dr. David Sweet were the speakers. And odontology is sort of the investigation of teeth. And so many, many years before 1998, 45 years, the understanding was that the 2 children in the park were a brother and sister. However, in 1998, Dr. Sweet did an analysis on the teeth of the children and discovered that the children were actually 2 brothers. So the same mother and a different father. And this certainly changed the investigation. So for 45 years, people had been looking for a missing or brother and sister, who might these children have been, but the fact that it was 2 brothers changed the direction of the investigation. And so in 1998, Sergeant Honeybourn discovered a letter as he was going through evidence files in these banker boxes, and that it was written on January 29th, 1953. And a logger from Mission named Doug Adriel had written to the police that he had picked up a redhead in Mission about 3 years previous. So he had seen the article in the paper in April 1953, or in January 1953, and then read about this case and remembered this woman. And so he picked up a redhead and drove her and her 2 boys to Stanley Park and dropped them off. The woman nicknamed Lipstick Liz lived on Cherry Street at the time. So it was understandable that Honeybourn, seeing this letter mentioning 2 boys instead of a boy and girl, was the most promising lead to date. So if he could find her or living relatives, he could compare the DNA to the babes and potentially determine their identities. So for Honeybourn, Lipstick Liz was the main lead. So how did I join this task force? So upon my mother's encouragement, like she literally pushed me to the front at the end of the talk, I went up to Sergeant Honeybourn and shared that I was studying behavior evidence analysis, which is basically the process of analyzing physical and behavior evidence at a crime scene, and then kind of deducing who the offender might be and how the victims would find themselves in that location. I'll talk more about that in a bit. So I offered to volunteer as a researcher. So, I'm happy to, look through archives, whatever. And amazingly and graciously, Sergeant Honeybourn invited me to join. And so I ended up joining the Babes in the Woods task force. And the team included Sergeant Honeybourn and then broadcast journalist George Garrett and Dr. David Sweet. So for a year, I wrote a profile, my sort of analysis of the case. I collected a massive amount of research and I participated in community dialogues with the task force. And I was in heaven digging through archives and meeting with amazing and helpful archivists at Vancouver Police Museum, Vancouver Public Library, BC Archives, City of Vancouver, in Mission, at Mountain View, the Riverview Historical Society. It was truly an incredible experience. And this is a photo of myself and Sergeant Honeybourn at the Mission Community Archives as we're digging through trying to find anything about the woman on Cherry Street. So what is behavior evidence analysis? It's defined as the process of analyzing behavior patterns in physical and behavior evidence, then inferring or deducing offender characteristics from them. That is the fancy pants definition. And from 2000 to 2004, as I was doing a bunch of other things in my life, I studied behavior evidence analysis part-time online with Brent Turvey at the Forensic Criminology Institute. And Turvey is the author of the authoritative text on criminal profiling, and it's now in its 5th edition. When I was studying it, it was in its 2nd edition. And behavior evidence analysis actually informs my professional work because it is great, gives you great insight into human psychology. And it's actually strikingly similar to functional behavioral assessment that I've used in the education system, which is trying to understand why certain folks are struggling. And so Turvey says in a crime, it is critical to start at the scene and then work your way out. So that is kind of the approach that I did. And there is a massive amounts of things you can ask yourself about what the crime scene looks like. So where is it located? How can it be reached? What activities happened there? How would the offender have gotten there? Why did the offender choose that scene? Is it an outdoor scene? Is it the primary scene? Is that where the victims were killed? Or is it a dump site, which sounds quite callous, but is that where the bodies were laid after killing and they were killed somewhere else? There's a massive amount of questions that can be asked when you start at the scene and just start taking a look around, even if it's 50 years later. And so how did I know that area in Stanley Park was the crime scene? Well, Sergeant Honeybourn introduced me to retired Vancouver Police Department officer Grant Rainsley. And Rainsley was assigned to the Mounted Squad in Stanley Park for 6 years. And he was shown the Babes in the Woods crime scene location by the original officer at the scene, Bill Lindsay. And so Rainsley kindly spent the afternoon with George Garrett and myself at the site, and my brother Frederick Thorsen tenaciously captured the event and our discussion on video. So these are some screen captures from that day in February 2004. And so we talked about what would have happened, why did it happen there? And what had happened was that in January 1953, a Parks Board worker named Albert Tong had been working in the park and had come across a skull. And he then let the VPD, the Mounted Squad, know. And so then Grant Rainsley kind of said, what would it have been like? So the police officer would have had to gallop back to the stables and call the detectives. It would have taken some time for them to get there. But he felt that if you knew the park in the late 1940s, you would know that this trail, the left trail, takes you out all the way back to the entrance of the park. That story about one woman running away with one shoe, where an eyewitness, potential eyewitness, talked about, that happened over by Pipeline Road. That's logical. So this is Grant kind of processing the event. And the crime scene is at sort of where the Chickadee and Eagle Trail meet. And there's an old snag there, an old dead tree. And so my family and I placed a memorial stone at the foot of that snag after I had visited that scene. And this would be February 14th, 2004. And I've returned to this particular spot over the years. It is mystical, it's magical, it's hidden away. And I find little stones and toys and things that other visitors have left, which is quite wonderful. And really being at the scene helps you understand how over these years that these children lay there before being discovered, that outdoor scene, what would have happened? What were the processes after they had died? And how did nature kind of take them back? Those are questions I asked myself as we stood at that scene. And then in 2004, the task force spent an afternoon examining 2 banker boxes that were stored at the Vancouver Police Museum, not on display. And I returned to the museum by myself and spent quite a few hours cataloging all the contents of those boxes because I wanted to make sure we had a good list. And there are items, this is a picture from the 2004 display of items in the window, and that show these recreations of the skulls, recreations of human bones. However, it does show actual, like a leather belt that was found there, zippers from clothes, an old lunchbox, children's shoe, a hatchet. There were 2 aviator helmets at the scene. And so these were put on display, and the display has since changed with new developments, but this is what I saw in 2004 in the display at the Police Museum. And then in these banker boxes, I will not read out what all these lists are, but I in detail read out these lists. And for those that would like a PDF of my presentation, I'm happy to share that. But I meticulously went through these boxes, and in these boxes were various notes from other researchers. There was articles of clothing. There were new types of shoes to compare with the shoes found. There were pieces of clothing. There was knitted material, a scoop and a shovel, all sorts of things that really recreated the scene and brought us right back to that late 40s. And it was a spiritual experience to be touching these items. One very important item was in a kind of garbage bag, and it was actually the fur coat that had been left at the scene. So they believe that the mother took off her fur coat after killing the children and laid the children out and then covered them with her fur coat. And then her foot may have been caught between the children. So there was one shoe left at the scene. And so she would have left, if she is the offender or if she is at the scene, she would have left one shoe, her fur coat, and left the park just wearing one shoe and the remaining of her clothing. And so we pulled out this deteriorated fur coat, which was this old rabbit fur. And of course, it wasn't wearable. It was completely disintegrated, but it was very moving. And so the list continues as I meticulously went through each item of evidence. And then there were safety pins because the children's underwear had been taken in. So they were not well-to-do, these children. But one item that stood out for me was a button, a Bakelite button that had belonged to that fur coat. And this is a picture on the left from April 15th, 1953, where they showed in the newspaper what they had found, the scene, hoping that someone would come forward. And this particular button really moved me. It was gorgeous. I did not steal it, but I became obsessed with it. I sketched it. And so then over the years, I looked on Etsy, could I find that button? I don't know why I became completely obsessed. And so in 2012, I actually found an identical button and ordered it right away. And this is my friend Jocelyn Louise in a rabbit fur coat that I found on Etsy, as well as we recreate that moment in the park. Very exciting time to kind of recreate these visuals. But the button kind of holds some magic for me, where I could then go deeper into my understanding of what had happened. And so then in the spring of 2004, I reviewed the letter that the police in April 1953 had received from this logger. And I discovered that we had overlooked an important detail, thereby making the lipstick Liz lead incorrect. There were 2 aviator helmets at the scene, 2 children's leather aviator helmets. But the logger indicated in the letter that one of the boys had left his helmet in his car, and so the logger returned it to their school. So there should only have been 1 helmet at the scene. It was quite a moment to discover this and talk to Sergeant Honeybourn about it. So as a volunteer, I kind of knew my time was up because we had reached the end of Lipstick Liz, and eventually the task force dismantled. And then the next day, Sergeant Honeybourn appeared in the paper that the case goes cold again. So now, what is the story that found me through all this? So in late 2003, while reviewing boxes of case files and notes, I rediscovered an article that I had printed out as a comparison case of what was happening with young women at the time in Vancouver. And I recalled that in these evidence boxes and files, there was an article from 1984 that said a waitress named Molly in Alberta with 2 kids had quit her job in 1947, saying she headed west. And it was this jarring moment that I compared this article I had printed out as an example of someone who was in dire straits in Vancouver. And then this name Molly in Alberta. So it was this strange tap on the shoulder. I decided I needed to pay attention to this. This was the article that I had printed out about a young woman named Molly O'Dwyer who had jumped off the Georgia Viaduct on November 6, 1947, and she passed away 3 hours later at Vancouver General Hospital. And in the article, it says that she was from Edmonton. There was a note in her pocket, and then that her local address was believed to be 314 East 5th in Vancouver. And the reason they knew that was that at the hospital, Charles Swanson, who was a worker at the hospital, actually identified Molly as his tenant at the time. So I became entranced, obsessed with this young woman. And so as I was exploring the archives from 2003 to 2004, I did a parallel research on Molly because it was so intriguing. And I obtained from the BC Archives her coroner's report and her autopsy report. And then the biggest shift, because I really wanted to know more about her and uncover what her family was about, was when I visited Celtic Creations at Lonsdale Quay, and Helen Ritchie there suggested that Molly is a nickname for Mary. And that opened up everything for me, because then I was actually searching for Mary O'Dwyer. And so for the past 20 years, I've been able to flesh out this heartbreaking story of an immigrant family. And Molly's parents, Michael and Nora, came to Canada in 1929 with their 4 children via Pier 21. And they moved to Derwent, Alberta, then to Edmonton, and then eventually to Vancouver. And as I'm uncovering this, I couldn't believe how much information I could find through archives, through online searches. So all 4 O'Dwyer children, Michael and Nora had 4 children. They died tragically through various circumstances, very young, between the years of 1941 and 1963. And then Nora, the mother, died in 1963, and eventually Michael died in 1968. And I did at the time contact as many O'Dwyers as I could think of through online searches, through contacting the O'Dwyer clan in Ireland, and no one knew anything of this family that had died out by 1968. And so intriguingly, knowing that Molly traveled back and forth between Edmonton between 1941 and 1947, and that she died by suicide on November 6, 1947, and that there was an eyewitness who had contacted the police about that she had seen a woman on October 5th, 1947, run out of the park wearing one shoe and no coat. I couldn't help but wonder, is there a chance that Molly is connected to the Stanley Park case? Because everything was lining up too well. The only thing I didn't know, did Molly have children? But this braid had happened, and I found myself wrapped up in this braid. And at the time, all these 20 years, a lot has been happening in my life. And, my parents have passed away. I've gone through bankruptcy, new jobs. My children have grown, and struggles with mental health, and developing my art career, developing everything, moving, all these things have happened. But throughout it, I have kept at this story. It's given me comfort and excitement. And I've been very open about the story. And so I've been approached by journalists and TV producers who wanted to do a Netflix series. And they wanted me to be the story, but that did not feel right. And it was actually a pretty horrifying experience. And so, but the most empowering thing that I could do was to say no. And in 2017, I thought, well, I need to tell this story. I have all this material in The Babes in the Woods and about Molly, but what is the story? So I experimented in January, and starting January 15, 2017, and put out an online experimental graphic novel that was literally done in real time. Once a week, I would create a new chapter. It forced me to just digest and, for lack of a better word, vomit out the story, however it looked. It gave me perspective. And then at the height of lockdown, I had took out all so there was this time to kind of reflect on everything in life. And so I took out all my personal research, which is 6 banker boxes worth at least, and spread it out on the floor. And I sat there, and I knew that the story I actually needed to tell became abundantly clear. I needed to release the O'Dwyers from the Babes in the Woods story. It was kind of stuck. It wasn't allowing me to move forward with what I really wanted to talk about, which was the O'Dwyers. So I reorganized everything and relabeled all the folders. And amazingly, on February 14th, 2022, there was breaking news that on Eve Lazarus's blog initially, that the Babes in the Woods had been identified. And that's where I would encourage you to go to Eve Lazarus's work to find out that story. This is an illustration of the young boys that I did for Eve's latest book. And it shows that Derek and David are the young boys, 2 brothers, and with the same mother, different fathers. And that is a story that's not for me to tell. And so as I said, I encourage you to check out Eve's work. But what was incredible was this wonderful euphoria that they had been identified, even though the case is not solved because we don't know really what happened to them, other than we know who they are. But the O'Dwyer family, whose timeline was so intertwined circumstantially with the Babes in the Woods, was liberated, and certainly so was I. And so that brings me to my big project now. So at the BC Archives in 2003, an archivist brought me a photocopy of a page from a file that mentioned Molly O'Dwyer, because as I said before, I was doing this parallel research with the archives on Molly O'Dwyer in case she had something to do with the Babes in the Woods. And so it was an Essendale patient file. So Essendale, which was formerly Riverview, now called the Place of the Great Blue Heron. This file belonged to Molly's younger brother, Joseph. And that's where I again felt this tap and a whisper in my ear. And so it was 2017, and it was halfway through creating that online graphic novel experiment that I was given access at the BC Archives to Joseph's full file. It was about 300 pages, and the content was meticulous and so rich, and I was euphoric. I also knew that the story now needed to be told through Joseph. And so things kind of changed again, that the patient file became the guiding light. So why is it important for me to tell it as a graphic novel? And this is a wonderful quote. I won't read the whole thing, but really it talks about that visual storytelling allows material to exit your mind in unique ways. It allows for both the telling of a story of the past and a reflection on it at the same time. And it enables you to create a sense of yourself as an artist and other readers as witnesses. And truly, it helps me process the story that I was chosen to tell. And so in 2022, I created an experimental broadsheet, a newspaper, 12 pages, and with the help of a generous grant from the Vancouver Heritage Foundation. And so I created it as a teaser. And the newspaper format is a celebration of the newspaper, and certainly a celebration of my father and his love of newspaper. And it's also, when people hold it, it's this tactile connection to history. And ironically, almost 20 years of research became an almost wordless document as you go through the visuals. And there's lots of clues in these 12 pages of this particular prologue. And this is an example of page 2 and 3. And you'll see on the bottom left that I actually drew that button that I'm obsessed with. That was just, no one who didn't know about the case would not know why that button is there, but I had to draw that button from the Babes in the Woods case. And this prologue is basically a journey following Joseph O'Dwyer, which I gained from his case files, as he moves throughout walks from downtown Vancouver on November 21st, 1948 to Kitsilano, and then eventually tries to commit suicide by drowning himself in Kitsilano Pool. He is eventually taken to Vancouver General Hospital and eventually is taken to Essendale, the provincial mental hospital at Essendale. And he was then 22 at that time, and he unfortunately died at Essendale at age 37. So where do I go next? So the prologue has been this extraordinary, life-changing experiment. I applied to the Vancouver Heritage Foundation Yosef Wosk Publication Fund. I need to get on with this. I need to make a teaser. It needs to be a newspaper. And so with those 12 pages complete, thanks to the Vancouver Heritage Foundation, life has changed significantly. And even though I still have my youth work, I still have my creative engagement work, my art career and my graphic novel career is taking off. And so amazingly, I found out a week ago that I was given a grant from the BC Arts Council to create 24 more pages. And then between April 24th to May 6th, I've been accepted to the Banff Center for Arts and Creativity Residency, Spring Thematic, Graphic Novels and Visual Narrative, where I will have 2 weeks to focus on the graphic novel. This is something I have never done before in my life, to fully take time away from family, from my other bread and butter work, and to focus on my art career. And so the pages that I'm currently working on for parts 1 and 2, they are designed, this is my outline that you'll see to the right. It is inspired by a quote from Ulysses, where James Joyce talks about this, that she is intertwined with me and I'm intertwined with her and I'm kind of drowning. And it was this perfect metaphor for what I feel my connection to the story is. And so I've broken it down. This may change by the end, but I've broken down the work to be a tabloid one. I'm hoping to publish it as a tabloid, 48 pages, to cover the time that Joseph is in care. And then season 2, or tabloid 2, will cover the time, the journey of the family going back in time from 1929 to the end of their life as they travel to Canada, to Alberta, to Vancouver, eventually to Lake Cowichan. And then tabloid 3, the final part, will be individual stories about each of the siblings, but because each sibling has the most profound story, and the history behind them is absolutely incredible, and I need to share their stories. The final part will be Joseph's death. And then there will be a final broadsheet, the epilogue. And so the first broadsheet is a limited edition and will never be recreated as a broadsheet again. It might be incorporated, which one day I hope to be a complete book. And so the overall theme of the work is circumstance as destiny. And that was thanks to a conversation I had with this extraordinary young man who studied literature at UBC. And we talked about circumstance. And he said, I really think that your story is circumstance as destiny. And so my project will explore history, genealogy, forensic, psychiatric history, mental health treatment history, immigration, war, and more. And using the patient file as a starting point, I explore the metaphor of total institution. It's a perfect metaphor for what the O'Dwyers found themselves in. They were sort of, for lack of a better word, victims of total institution. Oliver Sacks explained that the Canadian-American sociologist Irving Goffman ranks all asylums together as total institutions, places where inmates are de-individuated, deprived of all autonomy or freedom or dignity or self, reduced to nameless ciphers in the system. And this can be within a school setting, within an employment setting, within a mental hospital setting, etc. But what I want to do is give flesh and bring the O'Dwyers back to life, because somehow they chose me to tell this story. I came across this lovely quote by David Eagleman quite a few years ago. There are 3 deaths. The first is when the body ceases to function. The second is when the body is consigned to the grave. And the third is that moment sometime in the future when your name is spoken for the last time. And certainly the O'Dwyers could have died out, but somehow I discovered this family. So I feel so lucky to have been chosen, perhaps by these happy ghosts, to tell this story. And so once the drawings are completed, I have one more very important step. Molly is buried at the Mountain View Cemetery in an unmarked grave. And so my goal is to give her a grave marker. And my dream is that I include the names or the words Anam Cara, which is soul friend. It's a Gaelic term, because I really feel that Molly and Joseph and the O'Dwyers are connecting with me through time and space. And so that is the end of my talk. And I want to give a special shout out to Jocelyn, who was my model for Molly all these years, to journalist and writer Eve, to coroner Laura, to journalist Pamela Post, to a dear friend Anne Banner, who introduced me to intricate trinkets and vintage items that infuses my home, but it just contains these stories that just infuse my work. And my dear friend Patty Henderson, who is often a creative collaborator and who I will be going for a residency in France with in 2024, where we both take this massive step to focus on our personal projects. And to archivists and history keepers everywhere, and in particular Vancouver Heritage Foundation for this wonderful opportunity. Thank you.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Kat. That was such an incredible presentation. I know that on behalf of everyone on staff, we're just really excited to see where this goes. There are a couple of questions in the chat, so we'll start with those. If anyone has any additional questions, feel welcome to pop those in the chat. One of the questions that got asked was about how can people support you, buy your work? Where can they find that? Is it your website?
Absolutely. Yes, that's a very kind question. So artists tend to live a bit in isolation, but yes, my website is kind of the go-to site. I have taken myself off social media quite a bit of the last years, and it was actually quite liberating for many reasons, but my website is something that I upkeep all the time. There is a link on there to the Joseph broadsheet if people want to purchase it there. And I always keep my website up to date with the latest events and things like that. Something I might be doing as I get deeper into this project over this next year is to do a Patreon thing where people can then have the privilege of seeing the drawings in real time, different little gifts and things like that. That's always a fun thing to do. And so yes, but feel free to contact me. My contact information is on there, and I'm always happy to answer questions.
Wonderful. Yeah, that's always a fun thing to kind of, it's like a behind the scenes look, right, at a process of something. So little tidbits as you're working along. Couple other questions. One was, what did the brother die of? He was so young.
So yes, it's it's very moving. It almost brings me to tears as I think about the access to that patient file. And so he was only 22 when he came into the hospital. And certainly what was moving to see, I've accessed several patient files from Essendale, now the place of the Great Blue Heron, is the meticulous nature of the record keeping. But also we tend to, I know I was certainly coming at it through a lens of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which is a very important work, but there is that sort of demonization of mental health treatment. But I do feel that they were doing the best they could. However, Joseph was diagnosed with schizophrenia at the time. He came in, through my research, there's many things I could maybe take a look at, like, was it more bipolar, whatever. That is not for me to say, but he then went in with a diagnosis of schizophrenia. So at that time, that included, over the span of the years that he was in, 200 electroshock therapy treatments, coma insulin shock therapy, eventually a lobotomy. They were trying to quiet him. It was the era of being quiet meant you were healing. But Joseph had this insatiable spirit, it seems like, and fought through even after the lobotomy and tried to escape several times. And he eventually ended up at Colquitt's, which was the hospital on Vancouver Island for the criminally insane. Part of it was so he could be closer to his parents, but then eventually they were moved back because Colquitt's closed. He did die of a ruptured intestine. And so it was on his final days where he got a really nasty fever and they didn't know what was happening. And then eventually he showed up at the nurse's station and passed away on the floor there. So towards the end of his treatment time, his incarceration, antipsychotics came on. So his treatment was before antipsychotics, but right towards the end, around end of 1950s, those were being used more, and they were heavy at that time. They've changed now, but they're still very heavy. But one of the side effects was this intestinal issue, so creating this almost like a hernia in the intestine that would rupture. So that was not uncommon. So unfortunately, that's what he passed away of. And at that time, his mother had passed away 3 months earlier of cervical cancer. And so his father was the last to be alive. But what was touching was in that patient file, you also saw letters from the father and from the mother initially. But as the years go by, it was only 15 years, the father's handwriting deteriorates over time, and it's very touching.
Wow, fascinating insights from just that one file, right? Absolutely.
It's incredible.
A couple other questions in terms of kind of the practice and the process. So in terms of comic artists that have inspired you.
Oh, yes. Oh, my goodness. So I mean, when I was little, I was very into the Archies. So maybe that's my first inspiration. But certainly the first inspiration as a child was my father, because he drew cartoons. When he was 12, living in Norway during the World War II, he actually wrote to Disneyland asking for a job. And he got a letter back from Mr. Walt Disney, and which is incredible. And so Disney cartoons as I was little was my main inspiration. And then in recent years, my favorite cartoonists are like Emile Ferris. She wrote My Favorite Things Monsters, certainly Robert Crumb, so many artists, Daniel Klaus. I just love them all and collect way too many books, my family might say, but I kind of process them and digest them and then bring them out. But I would say that it is Robert Crumb's approach of this sort of like edging on cartoonist, but realism in his work, where he has an extraordinary book that he illustrated about Franz Kafka, for example, that really influenced me. But Emil Ferris, My Favorite Thing is Monsters, is an extraordinary book that came out a few years ago, and I really recommend it. But again, it's that sort of like realism, and then you can see, for those that see the broadsheet, that there's elements, a bit of surrealism that comes in, and then putting a bunch of clues in there.
Absolutely different layers to look at.
Mhm.
So in terms of kind of when you're creating a page, do you have like a practice you do and decide how to present the information, how to lay it out?
Yeah, so that's what was wonderful with the broadsheet was, because I wasn't coming into the broadsheet as already graphic novelist, right? I was coming in as an illustrator, an artist, and researcher and writer. And so having that sort of like timeline with the grant really helped me get my stuff together. And so the first thing I do is get the reference photos. So I will cut out reference photos, gather reference photos physically, I print them out. And then I will, as I look at, I use very much the 3-act or the 5-act structure to design a page and to design the whole story, so that it becomes almost holographic, that one page should tell a complete story and the whole thing should tell a complete story. And then I start to cut out images and overlay them and see what might work. And then eventually that page kind of forms with these resource photos. And then for the broadsheet, it was very particular in terms of dimensions. And so I work very cheaply. My favorite paper to draw on is crappy newsprint. Packing newsprint, because it has the smoothness that I love. If I buy a newsprint pad from an art supply store, I don't like it. It's too rough. And so I use newsprint, and I use China marker, which is basically a grease pencil, and you can't erase it. So I don't use eraser, and then I just kind of start to lay it out and then just dive in. And I really recommend for those people who are wanting to pursue creative careers or are in creative careers, that you just keep at it, not the project itself, but it's a habit. I will draw every day, or I will do something creative every day just because I can't not, but it doesn't have to be about the project. And so that way, when you're ready, like when something like that grant from Vancouver Heritage Foundation comes up, you're just ready to go. And so that was what happened. But those pages kind of formed as I thought about what is the story I need to tell within, limiting myself within 12 pages. The limit was fantastic, because then it's like, I'm not going to tell that story now. I can't do that right now. So that was quite delicious as well. But it's really about, for me, I gather as much research and resources, obviously 20 years later, as I can. So now it's like, okay, this is the beginning of the end of this particular story. So giving myself this next year to complete it is really exciting. Also, the event today, I feel personally, is almost my saying goodbye to the babes in the woods for the story. So, it's always a part of me. It's inherent in me, but it's, a big day.
Absolutely. I was really intrigued by when you were talking about kind of the history of kind of mental illness and institutions and mental health. And if there's a question in the chat kind of asking about like parallels to current mental health issues, and I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
100%. In my professional work, I work with folks who may struggle with mental health challenges. Personally, in our family, there is some mental health challenges. And so the research has really fed my work and my insight into, but then also my modern day has fed my work as well, my understanding of the mental health system. And having followed Yosef through his time through the mental health system, having followed young people through the mental health system, really informed both ways. But it also really helped when a family member had to go through the mental health system in a crisis, where I was like, I know what's happening, I know what's going on. And so it was really interesting that way. I am voracious in terms of studying the latest upkeeps in mental health treatment and mental health issues. I really recommend an organization called MAD in America, and they are a group of peer supporters psychiatrists, mental health workers, folks interested, and they do a real good critical thinking on mental health issues. And certainly that is a massive issue in society today in terms of how to provide services, but not to incarcerate people for being ill.
Absolutely. So we're getting to the end of our time. There was one question that I did want to kind of pose on the way out, which someone asked, just in terms of, obviously you've got some exciting things coming up with this project that you're working on, but do you think that if you're saying goodbye to Babes in the Woods, you're focusing on this, do you think in the future there's going to be some more research on cold cases? Is that something that's always you're going to be drawn to?
Most likely. Now I realize, oh my goodness, when is that next tap on the shoulder? Movingly, I was approached a few years ago. I was actually co-facilitating something out at the city of Surrey with the city of Surrey, and the co-facilitator actually had a moving question for me because her sister was killed when she was only 13 and it's unsolved. And so she's like, what do you think of approaching this creatively? And so those kind of questions are coming up quite a bit, which is really interesting. And I don't take those kind of requests with, lightly, but, it'll be very interesting what comes after this. I know that personally, after this particular project, I am actually going to focus on my 1977 diary, which is ridiculous, but it's a grade 9 diary, and it is so rich and so stupid and so innocent that it would make this perfect sort of like palate cleanser for me to do that as a graphic novel. But the deep stories, they're still there. There's a one particular patient file that I might go back to as well, because she really moved me. There's also, as you may have seen in my presentation, a bunch of birds. And so I'm pretty obsessed with birds, but they do represent sort of this fragility and strength. But I have been experimenting with wondering about drawing the story as birds as opposed to humans. So it's something that I'm experimenting with, and who knows what will unfold. So I know now that I have an outline, that outline might just be completely exploded, but it's basically so fun to have the guidelines and the direction now, and we'll see what happens.
Yeah, absolutely. We're looking forward to seeing what comes next. So thank you so much for this presentation. Thanks to everyone for joining. It's really great to dive into local stories and kind of talk about history and heritage in this way. I think it's really unique and something we haven't done a lot of, which I'm very excited about. So just a few things I want to mention before we say goodbye. If you're wanting to learn more about Vancouver's history, there's lots of different resources on our website that'll get you started. Kat mentioned archives, and there's lots out there that you can dig into if you're curious. There's her book, there's Eve's book, there's lots of things to explore. If you're interested in our upcoming events, we do have a few coming up. We have one at Highcroft on March 28th that's going to be focusing on contemporary commemoration in historic settings with Bill Pache. We have a lunch and learn coming up in April. That'll be with the City of Vancouver Archives, celebrating their 90th year. And then also, if you are someone or you know someone who is interested in applying for the Yosef Wosk publication grant, that is open for this year's intake, and it closes on May 15th. Information can be found on our website as well. The best place to stay up to date on what is going on at VHF is our e-newsletter and our social media. So if you're not following along there, I encourage you to do so. But thanks again for joining us this afternoon. Thanks, Kat, for sharing your work. And we're really looking forward to seeing everyone soon at one of our future events. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you, everyone.